Okay, so we're going to talk about universality today. So I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint. And first of all, just a reminder of the format for the first four of these brief talks about characteristics or indeed criteria for the middle way. So I've modified the title of this one, so it was originally Universality, but to avoid any misunderstanding, I've adapted it to Universal Aspiration. So the one we had last time, 2 weeks ago, was Practicality, and then we'll go on to Judgment Focus and Error Focus in subsequent occasions. Okay, so universality, probably first thing to say here is to note particularity. So obviously I'm in a particular situation, as is anybody else. So I'm an embodied human with lots of limitations and a cultural context. So, you know, I'm an Englishman, I'm middle-aged, intellectual, and so on. So those are all going to limit whatever I say. So I'm not going to pretend to be in a neutral position. It's not that kind of talk about universality. However, I do think universality as an aspiration is never less important. So that's what this talk is about. So yeah, let's start with just some idea about what universality might be. If you have universal beliefs, well, you know, if there are to be true universal beliefs, then that's pretty demanding, really. So they'd have to be true for every person in every culture, and not just that, but throughout space and throughout time. So that potentially means, well, you know, universal means in the whole universe, doesn't it? So that's an incredibly demanding criteria to meet. Obviously, I would have thought impossible. But just to give you an idea of what a universal belief might be, an example would be determinism. You know, so the belief that some people have that every event could, in theory, be predicted if you had all the information. Now, how anyone can claim to know that, I really don't know, because they'd have to claim that they knew that to be the case on the other side of the universe, in the distant future and the past, and in every possible situation, far, far beyond our grasp. So the other issue with universal beliefs is well, that they are beliefs, so they are made out of words, and words are made meaningful by our particular embodied experience. Now that's the embodied meaning thesis, which I'm not going to say a lot about now, but it is an important part of middle way philosophy. So it's something that we could discuss in future. But it's certainly something that middle way philosophy depends on, is this perspective that meaning depends on the body, not just on a relationship to some abstract truth out there. So given that it's our meaning, then that makes it all the more difficult to have any kind of universal truth. But even if we could have some other sort of meaning, then its relationship with reality is uncertain, and the scope of those claims goes far beyond anyone's experience, even the sum of our total experience. So the upshot of that seems to be we really have no justification for believing in universal truths of any kind. So that's the skepticism aspect of the middle way approach, which I'll talk more about in another session, but that just gives you a taste of it. Now, nevertheless, although it's so difficult for us to grasp any universal, in fact, impossible for us to grasp any universal truth, I think we need to make an important distinction here between the way we understand universality. So there's a top-down or a bottom-up way of thinking about it. So top-down universality would be to start with a claim that we know something to be true in all cases, like determinism as the example I just gave you. You know, that we know that every event is caused and we could theoretically predict it, or that God exists, or any kind of claim like that. So you could claim that positively, that X, whatever it is always true, or negatively that it's not true. And that would also mean that our claims about it are all equally incorrect. So because we, as it were, can't be certain, therefore we got no justification. So that's another kind of absolute. So this is an important aspect of the middle way, that we're trying to avoid both of those absolutes. That's the top-down approach. So you're thinking in terms of absolutes that must be true. Now, what I'm going to suggest instead is the bottom-up approach to universality, which is an aspiration to universality. So we base our beliefs on the evidence so far. So we could have a provisional belief, a belief that we could possibly change in the light of new experience or evidence, but a belief that we think is universal so far. It seems to apply in all the conditions that we've been able to experience. But the important point of the aspiration bit here is that we could keep looking beyond a restricted range of conditions. So we might start off knowing just about, you know, what happens in Britain, for example, but then we start looking beyond that. We say, well, would this apply in other cultures? Would this apply to Amazonian native groups, for example? Or would this apply to aliens on other planets, if we can even, you know, imagine properly what they will be like? So the bottom-up approach keeps testing, keeps asking questions in order to try to see whether our beliefs are universal. Test them. And if you have this bottom-up approach, then some beliefs are better than others. It's not that all beliefs, you know, these absolute beliefs are true, or that they're definitely not true. It's that some are better than others. And they're better than others if they've been applied to a wider range of conditions. So if we've tested them and checked them out more, then obviously we're getting closer to universality than we were before. So if we've looked at the evidence, for example, from, say, psychology or neuroscience about all humans and how humans function, then we can be more confident about what we say about humans than if we haven't, than if we've only based our ideas on what our neighbours do. Also, some beliefs are better than others if they take into account their limited standpoint. So we're avoiding the positive absolute and the negative absolute here. If we take into account our limited standpoint, then we are careful all the time to say, this is provisional. We don't know for sure. But nevertheless, we can be confident enough in what we know so far, what we believe so far. So that's bottom-up universality. But the interesting thing here, I think, that could be missed is that universality is still important here in this aspiration. So the universal standpoint is still meaningful to us, even if we don't have it. So we don't have a universal standpoint. We're not God. I imagine only God could have a universal standpoint if he exists in the sort of traditional sense of God. But that we don't have a universal standpoint doesn't imply that universality is false, that is, that there's no possible universality, or most importantly, that it's meaningless. It's still meaningful to us. Indeed, how could it not be meaningful? I wouldn't be able to talk about it now if it wasn't meaningful. I certainly wouldn't communicate anything about it to you if it wasn't also meaningful to you. So, indeed, we can find things very meaningful. Oops, sorry. We can find things very meaningful without believing in them. Yeah, obviously stories are the obvious example of that. You can believe in, you can find a novel and the story of a novel extremely meaningful, but you don't expect to encounter the characters in in your street or in any specific place. So that depends very much on the sense we can have from our bodies of what sorts of things are meaningful because they have an impact on our bodies. That meaning has been built up by a set of associations throughout our lives as we encounter different experiences. And so we might start off meeting a tree, for example, as a child, and we understand from that experience what a tree is, and we relate the word tree to the experience of a tree. In the same way, we can gradually, through a much more complex process, using metaphors and models and so on, come to understand even ideas like universality, or ideas like perfection or infinity, or whatever, very abstract ideas. And we do that really by extrapolating from our limited experience to apply the symbols that we have in our experience and stretch them a bit so that this new abstract idea becomes meaningful to us. So we are able to talk about universality, and it being meaningful means that we can keep seeking it. We can keep having some idea what we're looking for. That is a bit more universality from where we are. A bit stretching a bit further into the unknown, finding out a bit more. And that really means that, well, I would put it into terms that there's an archetype at work. You can see it as an archetype of truth. So an archetype, in my view, is a kind of a reminder or an inspiration. So an archetype of truth is a meaningful symbol to us that can keep inspiring us, giving us a consistent reminder of possibilities beyond our current assumptions. So we keep looking. So we keep trying to test whether our ideas are universal. So just to offer a bit of visual stimulus here, there are some visual images of truth here, ways in which people have imagined truth visually. And you can see how that has had, well, something about how truth has had an impact on people from these kinds of different pictures. So the first picture, you've got a mirror, so the idea of finding out about yourself, the skull obviously facing up to death, the balance, the idea of having to weigh things up and find a finer, more subtle view, middle way, in fact. Then there's the naked woman is a common symbol for truth. So obviously we've got the saying naked truth, haven't we? So the clothes as delusion, as it were, which might indicate there's something very attractive, but also something sort of rather shocking about new discoveries and new truth. And then the third picture is called the Bocca della Verità, and it's a rather strange thing that I believe is found in Rome. People put their hand in it as a kind of test that they're not lying, and they're supposed to have lost their fingers and things if they were lying. So that seems to be more about truth being rather frightening and a source of fear. So all of this is all about how truth is meaningful to people, what it means to people, and how it can inspire them, I think. There are obviously lots of other possible ways in which you could imagine it or symbolize it. Okay, so to finally wind up then, so the aspiration to universality is a criterion of the middle way. So we need to be able to aspire to universality, I think, to be following the middle way. So on the one hand, any approach is not the middle way if it appeals to absolutes. That's one test you can apply. And we talked about that last time a bit. So it's not practical if it just idealizes all the time, if it's always taking us to an abstract idea rather than helping us deal with the tension between our current situation and the ideal one. But at the same time, it's not the middle way if it denies absolutes, just says they're false, or treats them as meaningless. And that, generally speaking, would be relativism, or relativism is a kind of handy term for it. There are other terms you can use, but so I would understand relativism as the view that no one view is more justified than any other view. So there does need to be an idea of degrees of justification, I think, in the middle way. So the whole idea of a way, if you think about what a way is, it's a metaphor, obviously. It implies that we're going in a particular direction, doesn't it? So there has to be a direction that we're going in. Generally speaking, I'd identify that direction as something like one of increasingly adequate judgments that take more conditions into account. So the further we go along the way, the better we judge things, because we're taking more things into account than we did before. We've stretched our view of things beyond where it started. So that in a metaphorical sense, a slightly stretched, inverted sense, is a way, because it's something we've moved into, as it were, from where we were before. So note it doesn't require a final destination. It just requires a direction. And then so finally, then the aspiration to universality seems to be a requirement for the middle way. And so it is, I think, a way in which you can differentiate the middle way from relativist views of different kinds, which would include most kinds of postmodernism, for example, although there are some very subtle forms of postmodernism. And you know, what's also sometimes called subjectivism or nihilism. So there are various isms which don't offer any aspiration to universality, don't suggest that it's meaningful. Okay, I better stop there. So I'll stop sharing that and open up to questions. Vijay, is that a hand waving at me?
Yes, yes,
Great.
it was. How do you, first of all, is this your own framework, or are you basing it on, well, you're obviously basing it on readings, but have you formulated it uniquely yourself?
Yes, I formulated it over a period of time. So I kind of gave the general justification for the approach I'm taking in my introductory talk to the festival.
Okay,
kind of
very good.
Reference point for these little talks.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, just based on that, how do you then deal with the problem of hierarchy? If you've got aspiration and you say that judgment as you go further along this way becomes more increasingly adequate, as you put it, probably more informed, then you get back to the whole problem of priesthoods or whatever, or you get, say, lamas in Tibet being regarded as holy or even divine because they've gone fully along the way, and therefore they understand and judge things in a much more insightful manner. What's your take on hierarchy then?
I don't think we know enough about, or we can't tell what people have achieved, and and also their achievements are not as neat as that. So there's two areas here. One is uncertainty generally. So it's very difficult to tell if there is such a thing as an enlightened person or whatever. How on earth do you tell whether they are? And I've yet to come across a convincing account of that. But then there's also asymmetry. So one of the issues I think with religious leaders particularly, but also leaders generally, is that they or their followers may claim that they have achieved greater integration or greater insight or whatever, but they tend to do so in a very lopsided way. So I don't think that there is a single clear route of integration. People do it in very lopsided fashion. They can, for example, be much stronger in the cognitive than the emotive end, or much stronger in imagination than they are in thinking.
So you don't get a clear way of organizing socially around those principles. It just comes back to democracy, does it?
Well, that's a big subject. How you best organise an organisation. So there's certainly in the Middle Way Society we have a committee which is open in the normal way to organisational democracy. I think there's a big conversation to be had as to how we apply the Middle Way to produce the best kind of democratic system.
Okay, thank you. I'm still a beginner here.
Yeah, sure. Fear. Can't hear you, Fear. No, still can't hear you.
There isn't a Philip.
No, Theo was who was waving at me.
Oh, sorry.
I'll come back to you, Theo, if you can sort out your sound. Yeah, Bridget, you wanted to say something. You'll have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
I'm a narrative therapist, which is a post very much working with meaning is found through stories. All right, so we create truths, and they tend to be culture bound. But what would happen if the idea of universality wasn't a noun, as if we were in a positivist sense of seeking for the truth, but it became an adjective, like I'm a Quaker, so we would have our testimonies, the Quaker testimonies, which are also relevant in peace. What is peace? Non-violence. What is non-violence? So all these things all are very much culture bound. But I was just, as you were talking, wondering if we shifted the language from the strategic mind, which is always looking for the universal, categories, to qualities. So it's an adjective. So that was my question.
Yeah, that would probably help. Particularly one of the principles of the Middle Way, which I'll talk about in a subsequent talk, is incrementality. So that is trying to talk about qualities as a matter of degree rather than absolutes. So if you believe that somebody has a particular quality in total, like this great guru is totally integrated, for example, then that's an absolute. But talking in terms of qualities and doing so incrementally can be really helpful to get us away from this either it's totally true or it's totally false kind of mentality.
So in narrative, which might be helpful here, is we always separate the person from the quality. So that person isn't enlightened, but in what way has enlightenment visited you? Or how did that path lead you to a form of what? So we separate the idea of the universality of what we call getting caught in language into the universals of this person's a beautiful person. Well, aren't we all?
Yeah.
That's a meaningless thing, but we're always saying it. So we always separate the person from the quality.
Yeah,
which is quite an interesting play on language. But at the same time, we're very postmodern, we're post-structuralist in our thinking, but it does not mean we're relativistic. We take a position, very strong social justice position and power position, Foucauldian. So it's very, becomes more complicated.
Yep, yep. So it sounds as though there were some strong middle way elements there anyway.
Oh, definitely. Why do you think I'm attracted to it?
Yes, quite. Yeah. Okay, good. Any other thoughts, questions? Julian.
I wonder if you've got time to say a bit more about not just the kind of tension between sort of a narrow way of addressing specific conditions and universal conditions, but also like kind of individuality, like as a person, and society, and that kind of universality. So, so like, you know, in terms of a means of judgment and integrating desires, meanings, and beliefs, that's obviously a very embodied thing, and you can talk about a particular person in a particular body being more integrated. And then there's this thing, you could actually be living a very happy, fulfilled, very integrated life in a way that doesn't really necessarily take into account other people's desires or meanings or beliefs. So I just want to say a bit more about that tension.
Well, the movement out towards greater adequacy, to taking more into account, has both a psychological and a social aspect to it, and they overlap a lot. Obviously, understanding and understanding others' views and having a discourse with others' views is to some extent also having a discourse with internal views of your own and perspectives that you might have repressed in your own experience. So I see that the development of the individual and the moving out to more effective views in society as going hand in hand. Each of them is dependent on the other. But obviously there's also a balance to be struck in how much you emphasize one or the other in immediate terms. And people have obviously tendencies one way or the other. So one of the many divisions between groups in the world seems to be between the psychologically oriented and the sociologically oriented. So the people who want to talk about their individual experience and the people who want to talk about society. But yeah, I think it's good to try and do both. But I guess my impression is that the psychological is more neglected on the whole, but maybe that's my bias.
Sorry, I missed that last sentence, Robert.
So that my personal impression is that the psychological is more neglected, but maybe that's just my own bias. Okay, any other thoughts? I think we've got time for at least one more question.
Is our microphone working now? Can you hear me?
Sorry, who's speaking? Oh, Theo. Yes, go on, Theo. Yes.
So leading on from the question about organization and hierarchy, I noticed a lot of the points in the aspirations towards universality were very similar to an ideal scientific methodology. And I was wondering if you might think there's a role for some kind of peer review or publication process in organizational structure. Not that peer review is perfect.
Yeah, well, that obviously can be, in some circumstances, can be an expression of a middle way practice, is trying to be a good scientist and therefore getting your work checked up by others in the way that science has developed. But I think that's quite specific to the formal scientific setting, and obviously probably most of us are thinking in terms much more of individual judgments and how we deal with those. But yes, it is. I mean, it's good scientific method, I think. So there are a lot of relationships with, particularly the idea of provisionality goes along with scientific method. It's best.
And particularly for dealing with large-scale social problems that involve many people, it might be a useful mechanism.
Yeah, indeed. So there's the obviously when we're talking about COVID is an obvious example at the moment. So how do we find out about such a thing? Well, just relying on our own individual experience probably won't take us very far. So we need information from experts, which means we have to be able to judge the credibility of the experts and weigh it up. Okay, maybe just time for one more question, if anyone's got one. Andy?
Sorry, yeah, I'm just trying to unmute it. You're 2 or 3 times you've used the same sort of analogy about more adequate, progression, bigger, not better, and those kinds of judgments. It interested me when you talked about the way, and you said, of course, the notion of the way implies it's a journey too. And I've often come to think that actually it's not a journey too, it's a journey. So the adequacy of something is, and the change, the way that belief systems and ideas and so on have to change, is because the place on the journey is somewhere different. It's not that you're going to the perfect universal system, but you are going through different circumstances, different embodiments, if you like, which are then forcing you to look at ideas or beliefs or whatever in a different way. Does that square, do you think, with middle way?
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. Yeah. I mean, you could also understand that in terms of, we start off with different goals, with specific goals, but we have to modify those goals as we go along, and because our ideas about what they are change in the light of new experience. See, a very narrow approach tends to start with some goals and just want to achieve the goals, to modify the goals as well is a much more provisional.
Sure. But it also kind of explains then why universality is so attractive, I guess, because you think you've got an answer. Sorry, what? No, I'm expressing that badly. Why relativism is quite attractive, because in universality you think you've got an answer and then you discover it's not really a very good answer, you have to change it. So it then convinces you that actually that wasn't the right answer, but it may have been the right answer at that moment in those circumstances.
Yeah.
Just the world has changed and moved on.
Exactly. Yeah, quite. So you can say that about many, ideological movements and religions and so on, that they have sets of beliefs which may have worked in one set of circumstances, then circumstances change, but they carry on being rigid and therefore they don't adapt.
Right.
Okay, we better stop there, I think. So we'll stop.